Wonderful day for the law school, and it's a wonderful day to commemorate and celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution. I want to thank our distinguished panelists, and I of course want to thank the Saltman Center's National Board, which just met and includes several of these panelists, and also guests we have here today, a man who is no guest, Dean Richard Morgan. Judge Phil Crow. And I want to recognize Judge Ken Fehrenbach, who is with us today. And also our provost, John White. So, I also, of course, want to recognize and welcome our wonderful new member, year-old, at the Saltman Center, Professor Lydia Nussbaum. And our first Saltman Fellow, Jay Barrett. So, 10 years ago, Professor Gene Sternlight, who is, of course, a nationally recognized figure in the field of conflict resolution and law and psychology, formed an extraordinary partnership with Mike and Sonia Saltman. And together, over a decade, they have made the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution a national leader in the field. The center has been one of the signature successes for the law school and the university, and promises great things going forward. There is no better way to commemorate this than by recognizing the extraordinary work of Nelson Mandela and the example he set for us all. I'm going to steal an anecdote from Secretary Hillary Clinton, who was here a few weeks ago, and when was asked who was the most important and impressive person you met in your decades on the world stage without missing a beat, she said Nelson Mandela. She said that on the day of his inauguration as president of South Africa, he had invited 3 of his jailers to the event, and they took a prominent role. And that, of course, reflects the combination of idealism and political savvy and forgiveness that made moving forward possible. And this panel will discuss this today. The panel today brings decades of achievement and innovation and extraordinary insight into both this unique transformative figure and what he can teach us about conflict resolution. And to talk more about this exceptional panel, please join me in welcoming someone who made all this possible, Professor Gene Sternlight.
Lower the microphone just a little bit. Yes, so I joined the dean in welcoming all of you to this event. As he mentioned, this is our birthday party, and I know it doesn't look exactly like a birthday party, but I think that that's consistent with what we've tried to make the tradition of the Saltman Center over the years, which is to really celebrate conflict resolution, make it available to the public. We could have had a regular party, we could have had hats and balloons and cake and everything, but what we wanted to do was an event that we thought would be meaningful for all of you, meaningful for us. And when we tried to think about, well, what should be the focus of that event, I asked all of the panelists here, what do you think? And it took us about 1 second to say, let's honor the contributions of Nelson Mandela, who of course had just recently passed away, but also who is all of our personal heroes, as well as probably everybody in this room. The panel that we brought together is really exceptional. Richard Goldstone, of course, ran the Goldstone Commission in South Africa. You could read a lot about all these people in the program, so I'll just give you a few snippets. But Penny Andrews grew up in South Africa. Andrea Schneider, who's our moderator, is a renowned faculty member from Marquette who specializes in international conflict resolution. Karen Menkel-Meadows, one of the most well-known, best scholars in the area of dispute resolution and negotiation in particular. Bob Mnookin from Harvard is a renowned scholar who's written a book that has a chapter in it on Nelson Mandela and his negotiation strategies, as well as many, many other books. So we've got great, great panelists. I'm going to cede the floor in a moment to Andrea Schneider, who's my good friend and co-author, and she's going to be the moderator for today. But before we do that, I just wanted to give a few words of sort of happy birthday thanks to some of the people that are here. Of course, most especially Michael and Sonia Saltman, truly. This could ever have been possible without them. I still remember the day now, a little bit more than 10 years ago, when I interviewed for the job here, and to be honest, I was a happy faculty member at University of Missouri, and I really didn't think I wanted to come to Nevada, but I met with Mike and Sonia Saltman, and then I met with all the faculty members, and I met with Dick Morgan, and they convinced me that this was a place I had to come to. And it was so exciting to think about forming this venture with the Saltmans at the Saltman Center, and I've just been thrilled to do it every minute. So truly, I thank you. Thank you. The other folks I wanted to especially thank, of course, Dan Hamilton, who just spoke, our dean. I mean, he has been an incredibly enthusiastic supporter of the Saltman Center since he came in a little bit more than a year ago, and he's made lots of things possible that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. We've also got so many people here who have personally contributed so much to the center. We have, for example, Ray Patterson, who was the associate director. We have Lydia Nussbaum, where she went, there she is, who's the current associate director. We've got Peter Riley, who was our director of negotiation training for a number of years. Texas. We've got our board of advisors, many of whom are sitting up here, but also we have board of advisors members sitting in the audience, like Dick Morgan and Phil Pro, who were already mentioned. We've got Sandra Rodriguez, who's hiding in the corner. Without whom the work of the Saltman Center would be impossible, because she does everything from room reservations, catering, finances, budgets, PowerPoints, I mean, everything. Pin designs, programs, so. But we do have an excellent publications office. They provided a lot of the materials that you see now. We have wonderful IT people, some of whom are sitting here, and we hope all will go smoothly, and we've got our students and our graduates. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to cede the floor now to Andrea, who's going to be your moderator, and I hope we're in for a wonderful panel. Thank you.
Well, I would like to start by thanking everybody as well for gathering us all together. It is a treat, as always, to come out here to UNLV. And if for no other reason, there are many of us that are jealous to have such patrons here. If we could clone the Saltmans and replace them, and at every law school around the country, we all at other law schools would be delighted. So thank you so much for the two of you and for Jean and for having this kind of dream and making it come true. It really is a remarkable dream, and it's wonderful to be here 10 years on and moderating this wonderful panel. We are going to be talking about Nelson Mandela, and one of the key things that I've been asked to talk about, and I'll talk a little bit at the beginning, a little bit at the end, is really why is he relevant for today? And we all know, being in classrooms or raising kids, if you talk about anything that happened more than 5 years ago, they kind of glaze over and have no idea. It's not on Facebook, so it can't possibly be relevant. And so really, what is it relevant for us today? And I think there are really two answers for us to think about. One is really a model of how we can resolve intractable conflict. For those of us teaching dispute resolution, South Africa is a beacon of how we hope that all conflicts could be resolved, and we are disappointed time and again when that doesn't happen. And in an ongoing series of conflicts around the world that are often frustrating and painful and filled with pessimism, I think we still look to South Africa and his leadership as a model of what we hope to happen. So that is one reason. And I think the other reason, and we'll hear from our panelists today, who I know some of whom have personal stories to tell as well, he really is the model of leadership, and in looking at his personal characteristics, the father of the South African democracy, by actually stepping down and not becoming president for life, holding his country together, and his personal strengths. I looked at some of the eulogies of Nelson Mandela as I was thinking about my remarks, and one political leader after another quotes his humility, his ability to reconcile, as we've already heard. And one of my favorite quotes that our president used, "I'm not a saint," Nelson Mandela said, "unless you think of me as a saint, as a sinner who keeps on trying." I think that's a really good model for many of us. His awareness of personal flaws made him stronger, not a weaker politician. And frankly, as many of us face election day in 4 days that we would rather not wake up on Wednesday and see what's going on, again, Nelson Mandela is a model of humility, of someone who recognizes his personal flaws and continues to move from strength to strength, notwithstanding, is an inspiration for many of us. Our panelists today are a wonderful group of talent with different perspectives. You have their biographies in your program, and I know they will also share their personal perspective on what's either inspired them or their own interactions, so I will not go into their bios other than to encourage you to read those through. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them so that we can get started. We have a clip in between. We have a video in between, and then the lovely Professor Michael Meadow will get us started.
Would echo around the world. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunity. It is an idea for which I hope to live and to see realized. But my Lord, if it need be, it is an idea for which I am prepared to die. I want you to know
So my talk is Nelson Mandela, Transition from Violent Cause Activist to Peace and Justice Seeking Activist. I'm here today for two reasons. One is my now deceased colleague, those older in the room will remember him, Sam Dash at Georgetown, was one of the first Americans who was invited to meet with Nelson Mandela when he was still in prison. And I heard many tales from Sam about Nelson Mandela. And secondly, I'm going to be speaking about Nelson Mandela's early career, a violent supporting career, because he was a model for many of us in the 1960s when I was too a more or less radical activist for justice. So I want to talk today, as others will later focus on the last decades of his life, as we've now come to revere and honor a world statesman, the father of his country, a man who brought reconciliation and forgiveness and peace to South Africa and as a beacon and model for the rest of the world. But I want to focus on the earlier part of his career, although it continued all the way until the end. A man of fierce principles, commitment, and devotion to his cause of African nationalism, anti-apartheid freedom, and then later commitment to democratic, multiracial, and a just society for all. Conflict resolution theory focuses on the psyche, on the interpersonal communications, on a state of being of spirituality, forgiveness, and care. And everyone here who works on conflict resolution knows and cares about those issues. But in another part of our field, human rights and justice-seeking activists say it's not only about listening and hearing and forgiving. It is about achieving social justice, structurally, politically, economically, and with truth and justice for all. For me, Nelson Mandela was the model of the man who lived the words, "Without peace, there can be no justice, but without justice, there can be no peace." And I hope everyone will remember that both of those things are very important to our understanding of the man. I want to say a few words today in my time with you about three things. Nelson Mandela, the man, and his personal qualities, which you've heard a little bit about already. His methods, which have much to teach us in conflict resolution, and the lessons that we can learn from the man and his methods. Many of his lessons come from his personal qualities of strength. He was a boxer and a ballroom dancer. his commitment and determination. He rejected earlier efforts to free him when offered by President Botha because they were not on his terms. He stayed strong. His resilience. How many of us would have survived 27 years in prison, in wrenching, brutal, and isolating aloneness? His unwavering righteousness to his cause that also included very wily strategic ploys, including dissembling to his own fellow leader, Oliver Tambo, when he didn't quite tell him the truth about the negotiations which Mandela had begun to initiate with the South African government and President Botha. His human dignity, which you've already heard about, his relationships not only with his enemies later in life, but with his jailers while in prison. His identity, always expressed as a freedom fighter for his own African nationalist people, his tribe, but also for the whole world. His persistence, his patience, but ultimately and most importantly, his commitment to his principles. His negotiations throughout with his jailers during his time in prison and later with his enemies were always principled. He did not concede on many important points when asked to do so. He refused or wanted to refuse to leave prison when first asked because he wanted to control the way in which he was released. And as we all know more famously, he had the ability to apologize, to forgive, to change his mind. How many leaders do that today? He described his own leadership, in his own terms, as being a shepherd, one who led not from the front, but from the back of his people, watching where they were going, being with them, seeking to know what they thought. When banned, he traveled incognito throughout his country, initially to Transkei, where he came from, and then throughout the country to find out what his people wanted. And then, oh so gently, as a good shepherd would, from the back, leading them forward, drafting the Freedom Charter, to which he was committed for most of his life, and was the basis for the South African Constitution. It is important to think, as we look at what Nelson Mandela did in his life, that he had a very long life indeed. And so what we saw and what we see was the commitment to justice, a very strong political will, and the knowledge and experience and defiance, and indeed a commitment to violence, all the way to the end. Well, that was produced by his heightened sense of justice, and his then later on, seasoned with aging, and a desire for peace for himself, the next generation, his whole country, and indeed for the rest of us in the world. A leader who imagined a world in which blacks, whites, coloreds, and everyone could try to live more or less peacefully in the large landmass claimed by all of them with their different narratives of how they got there. But it was not always peace, truth, and reconciliation for Nelson Mandela. First, there were boycotts, strikes, protests, rolling actions, sabotage, in the beginning, hopefully of buildings, always with a hope not to hurt people, just as the IRA began in Northern Ireland, but later recognizing that the tactics were not working in a land where the oppressors had not only legitimate laws behind them, or illegitimate in my view, but legitimately passed laws of apartheid, and also the guns. And so, Nelson Mandela rejected the words of a fellow famous South African, Mahatma Gandhi, and said, nonviolence is a tactic. It is a tool for justice. But when the conditions no longer work for nonviolent resistance, we must turn to something else. Nelson Mandela founded the violent arm of the African National Congress, the Shield of the Nation, and he didn't want to kill people and was never personally attached to any particular act of violence, though ultimately convicted of high treason in organizing others to commit acts of violence against the state and against the illegitimate state. But Nelson Mandela, I remind you, for those of us as old as me or older, was a man of his times. Baader-Meinhof in Germany, later the IRA in Northern Ireland, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Cuba, the African independence movements in Kenya and elsewhere, in Vietnam, and in fact in the United States in the 1960s, at Berkeley, and where I was a student in 1968, Columbia, where I was a member of the SDS. There was a belief for him after Sharpeville, after Soweto, that nonviolent means would no longer work. And in order to bring down the oppressor, the tools of the oppressor, who was using violence against the freedom fighters, indeed had to be matched. So Mandela always described himself as a freedom fighter, fighting for freedom and justice, but did not renounce violence completely. Indeed, as some of you may know, when he was first asked if he was willing to come out of prison in 1985, he was asked to relinquish violence, and he refused. He said, "I will refuse violence when the South African oppressive state refuses violence." And it did not. And so he did not. When eventually he was released in 1990 and was asked to renounce violence, he used the perfect mediators and conciliators and peacemakers solution. He said, "There's something between a commitment to no violence and the continued use of violence. I will suspend violence as long as the state of South Africa does the same." Now, for those of you who've studied any of the history, you will know that in that period from 1990, when he was released, until later in 1994, when elections occurred and he was president, violence continued. Close to 10,000 people were still killed in that period. And in that period, Nelson Mandela once again said, "We may not be able to refuse violence again." And so he said the sanctions, the temporary suspension of violence will be removed. He continued to advocate during that period of negotiation, some strikes, lots of protests, mass demonstrations, and even some sabotage, to demonstrate to the National Party that he would not relinquish those tools which were necessary for the oppressive regime to realize that their time was over. At the same time, we know now from his own autobiography and many other sources that while doing that, Nelson Mandela, from within prison, within the solitariness of prison, reading and learning on his own, and making the terms of the negotiations, began very quietly to try to negotiate. He was very torn by the tensions between representing his party, the ANC, and doing things on his own. So once again, I think the image perhaps of the shepherd is a useful one. He had the strength because he also had the solitude to be in his prison cell and to learn from reading, from experience and from knowledge, from clandestine meetings with his fellow prisoners, other members of the ANC, and increasingly a new generation of more radical young protesters who came to jail. Another important lesson from Nelson Mandela. For those of you who know the literature, like John Paul Lederach, who has said to us, if we try to imagine peace and justice in this world, we must touch the fingers of our grandparents and touch the fingers of our grandchildren. In many parts of the world, it will take 3 generations and 100 years to achieve peace and justice. Nelson Mandela, when he met with the younger radicals in prison, said, "I must learn from them, just as I must try to convince them that we can negotiate." And so he was a bridge builder, a forgiving man who also believed that in the force of strength, we must continue to fight, not only on our own terms, but also on the terms that are offered to us by our oppressors, and try, if we can, to turn those around so that we can hear each other and speak to each other. Many have written about Mandela's commitment to the law, and I'm about to say what I think is one of the more radical things said in a building like this, which I often do in these circumstances. Why did I come to conflict resolution and dispute resolution? I'm the child of Holocaust survivors, and I believed in justice. I was a civil rights lawyer and all those sorts of things. But in Nelson Mandela's biography is a very important phrase, which I have never forgotten and speaks to me. As a man of law, he said, "I always hoped for justice. I never expected it." Both as someone who represented others and who spent many, many years as a defendant in several treason trials, the last of which led to his 27-year imprisonment. So many, after he died, extolled the virtues of Mandela as a man who believed in law, but I think he believed more in justice. And ultimately, as we will hear now, at the end, he believed that it was the combination of human communication, listening and understanding when people could sit down or cross enormous divides and talk to each other, as long as some of the asymmetrical nature of their power relations were corrected. And so we sometimes need law to do that, but law is not enough. Nor is conflict resolution enough if it only focuses on the resolution. In my view, the major achievements of justice in the 20th century, civil rights, racial justice, class justice, gender justice, and now sexual orientation justice, every single one of those justice claims came out of conflict, not only conflict resolution. So while we here at the Saltman Center work on all kinds of ways of mediating and arbitrating, and in my case, negotiating a great deal for conflict resolution, we cannot forget that part of how we learn from each other and from a man with a great strength of character and commitment to his causes, that when we say conflict resolution, there remains conflict.
I'm going to sound some of the same themes. The name of this conference is Making Peace with Your Enemy, Nelson Mandela and the Contributions to Conflict Resolution. Andrea Schneider asked me how I came to be interested in Nelson Mandela. And I really came to study Nelson Mandela when I began working on my last book, which really posed the question, which is implicit in the title of this conference: should you bargain with your enemy? I think that, in fact, you all know that in our field, many believe that you should always be prepared to negotiate with your enemy. After all, you only can make peace with your enemies. And who amongst us doesn't prefer diplomacy to warfare? Those of us who are lawyers, who among us doesn't generally prefer a negotiated resolution of a legal conflict rather than years of delays, thousands of dollars spent on depositions and interrogatories, and finally a trial? Before war or litigation, so we are often told, you should always try to resolve the problem through negotiation. There are, of course, those who make exactly the opposite point, and that is, you should never bargain with the devil. And by devil here, what I mean is an evil regime, an adversary you don't trust, someone who's hurt you in the past, who you think really is prepared to hurt you again in the future. The Faustian notion basically is the devil's probably at least as smart as you are, and no doubt more unscrupulous. And fundamentally, you negotiate with the devil, what you end up often doing is soiling your own soil. Soiling your own soul. Now, I, not surprisingly as a law professor, reject the categorical assertions. And in fact, my book is all about how to think about the decision of when to negotiate and when not to negotiate. But I really was led into the issue by thinking about who were my two greatest political heroes of the 20th century. And they were Winston Churchill, and there's a chapter about his refusal in 1940 to negotiate through Mussolini a possible end to the war before the United States was involved, and when the Soviet Union, by the way, had allied itself with Nazi Germany. He refused. And he's my hero because he refused. And Nelson Mandela, because Mandela chose to negotiate. And my elevator speech, in fact, in terms of the book, I can summarize it for you now in 30 seconds. Should you bargain with the devil? And my answer is, not always. but more often than you feel like it. And more often than you feel like it for two sets of reasons. One is that there are strong emotions and negative traps that get in the way of people thinking clearly about the costs and benefits of entering into negotiations with an adversary whom you don't trust and whom you may even think is evil. Jean is doing important work relating to the new work in cognitive and social psychology, and in fact, I identify a bunch of traps in the book, none of which I'm going to go over here, but let me say there are a bunch of them. The second reason, in fact, is things are tilted towards refusals to negotiate, really relates to something that I think Carrie suggested. And that is, typically when you negotiate with an adversary, if you're going to make a deal, the adversary is going to be, in fact, securing some things that the adversary prefers to the alternatives. And the same, no doubt, one hopes is true for you. Looking to the future, you think your interests are going to be better served. However, looking to the future and negotiating typically requires giving up the pursuit of perfect justice. And although people don't talk much about it now, the extraordinary achievement of Nelson Mandela was the achievement of a democracy with one person, one vote, with no group rights to veto. I mean, I assure you that the National Party, when they began negotiations, never conceived of conceding that much. And Mandela was steadfast and achieved it. But the other thing that people don't talk about quite so much is that one of the quid pro quos for that bargain was that white South Africans were going to keep their property. And they were going to keep the economic benefits, for the most part, they had acquired through decades of oppression. I assure you, there were many members of the ANC who did not consider that complete justice. And that much was given up. Now, let me, though, very briefly describe why he was my hero in choosing to negotiate under very challenging circumstances. As Carrie mentioned, in 1985, which is the setting of what I want to describe, Mandela had already been in prison for 23 years. He was 71. The ANC had stated publicly certain preconditions that had to be met before they would enter into negotiations. And in fact, the government had also suggested certain preconditions. The ANC's preconditions were that all political prisoners be released, that exiles be permitted to return, that they lift the ban on the ANC and the Communist Party. In short, some of the preconditions of the ANC were exactly the things one would have been negotiating about. On the government side, as Carrie mentioned, in fact, on January 31st, 1985, President Botha made an offer. In fact, it hadn't even been the first, but it was one that was very explicit and was public, that Nelson Mandela would be released from prison with only one condition, that he renounce all use of violence. He refused. And indeed, one of the interesting parts of the story is he remained in prison for more than 4 additional years, and in fact, he would only leave when in fact he thought, in terms of the negotiation strategy, it was the best time to leave. Mandela's public response is interesting. I mean, what he said was that only he snuck out through his daughter who read at a mass rally of the ANC. Only free men can negotiate. I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Implying, of course, he was continuing to refuse to negotiate. Now, in fact, that was Mandela's public response, a steadfast refusal to negotiate. In fact, his behavior was different. What he was struggling with is whether the time had not begun to initiate contact with the despised National Party that had erected the apartheid regime. And in deciding whether to do that, he knew that he should consult with his colleagues in the African National Congress. Although today most of us don't remember it, Mandela was not the head of the African National Congress. The head of it was this guy, Oliver Tambo. He was in exile in Lusaka, Zambia. Now, admittedly, it would have been hard for Mandela, and have been done easily, to communicate with Tambo ahead of time and ask, is it okay if I contact an official in the National Party? In fact, he'd often done that because through his lawyer they had been able to sneak information in and out. Moreover, he had a much easier way to decide. He wasn't completely isolated. Indeed, at the time, he was in prison somewhere where 2 stories up was his mentor, Walter Sisulu, who had been the first head of the ANC, and other members of the ANC. Well, Mandela faced the question, should I consult with my colleagues here before I write to initiate discussions? And he wrote in his memoir, my colleagues upstairs would condemn my proposal and would kill my initiative even before it was born. And indeed, what he ends up saying is, I chose to tell no one about what I was about to do, not my colleagues upstairs or those of Lusaka. There are times when a leader must move the flock, this is the metaphor, must move out ahead of the flock and go off in a new direction, confident that he is leading the people the right way. Well, what's interesting about that is he, of course, did initiate discussions. And he initiated them with this guy, Kobe Coetzee. You probably knew him, who was Minister of Justice. And over a period of 4 or 5 years, he engaged in extensive discussions with Coetzee. And beginning in 2 years after the initial contact, through a special committee, which included some very despised officials in the ANC. Once again, he really never disclosed completely to his own colleagues, including Tambo, all that he was doing, for the reason that, in fact, his colleagues would have said no. Now, so one set of negotiation lessons goes to this early phase, which is that obviously initiating negotiations with an enemy is extremely challenging, and leadership and courage are required. And the other part of it is, and it's something that I think is often emphasized enough, secrecy is often indispensable. We're all for transparency, but particularly where there are conflicts behind the table, doing things publicly can often make it impossible. Now, Mandela is also my hero because he combined, in ways that are just extraordinary, both empathy and assertiveness. In teaching about negotiation, I believe that the best negotiators both can demonstrate understanding of a perspective of people with whom they profoundly disagree, on the one hand, and on the other hand, assert their own interests nonetheless. Carey's metaphor, which in fact I was going to quote, was he was both a boxer, and he wrote in his memoir, I know how to fight against these fellows, I know how they feint, I know how they move, and I feel confident in this arena. At the same time, during the years he was in prison, he and his fellow prisoners adopted a policy of talking to the wardens and persuading them to treat us as human beings. And a lot of them did. And there were lots of things we could talk about. And the lesson was that one of our strongest weapons is dialogue. Sit down with a man, and if you're prepared, you cares very well, that man will never be the same again. Now, the last point I really want to make, and why, in fact, I can't elaborate on as much as I'd like, in my view, Mandela really was the greatest negotiator of the 20th century. And that really relates a lot to the conflicts behind the table. It's a part of the South African story that is not part, I'll say it, of the official narrative. There were many more blacks killed by other blacks between 1990 and 1994 than there had been in the preceding years. Now, part of it, as Richard Goldstone demonstrated, was because of the actions of agents provocateurs on the part of the government. But that wasn't the whole story. It was certainly an important part of it. And one of the great challenges Mandela faced is that behind the table, he had many within the ANC who really were not prepared to give up violence, and violence directed against other blacks as well as against the white establishment. And in the summer of 1992, a number were killed. 46 ANC followers, mostly women and children, were killed. And the police had made no arrests. It was a catastrophe. And Mandela soon addressed a large meeting with thousands of ANC followers who had lost faith in the peace process. And indeed, one of them left a note for him on the podium, which said, "No peace. Do not talk to us about peace. We've had enough. Please, Mr. Mandela, no peace. Give us weapons. No peace." Mandela threw away his prepared text and exercised moral authority. Here's what he said, I quote, "We must accept that responsibility for ending the violence is not just the government's, the police, and the armies. It is our responsibility. We must put our house in order. If you have no discipline, you are not a freedom fighter. If you're going to kill innocent people, you don't belong in the ANC. Your task is reconciliation." It takes enormous courage to say that to an angry audience. Now, one thing I'm often asked, because I've done lots of work relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and indeed for an organization known as Peace Hub, in June I was asked to head an international delegation and to be the chief mediator for a group of Palestinians and Palestinians and Israelis, all of whom had been involved previously in the negotiation process, in talking about the final status issues. What was going to be different about this is it was going to be webcast live, both in the Palestinian territories and in Israel. It never came to be because of the kidnapping. But what I'm often asked by Israelis is, why can't we find our Mandela? Now, what they mean by that is the person who do just what I said, and that is behind the table, restraining violence directed towards the other side. In my view, though, and this is what I'd really like to suggest to you, is that was not Mandela's core greatness. That was valuable, but not the most important. The most important aspect of Mandela, and I've said this to Israelis, is the need to have a leader to whom white South Africans could make concessions and maintain their self-respect. The white South Africans were, of course, deeply concerned with what is going to happen to me with this new constitutional regime. Does my adversary have a vision of a shared future that I would find bearable? Not a shared future that would be the first choice. And Mandela's greatness was both on a personal level and as on an intellectual level in terms of what he was proposing, suggested that he, in fact, would help them, would help the nation find a shared future that whites would find bearable. Indeed, one of the most striking examples of this is in terms of the cause of peace. De Klerk had stakeholders, whites, far to the right of him. And one of the most extreme was the head of something known as the Volksfront, General Constant Vijan. Mandela told him, if you want to go to war, I must be honest and admit that we cannot stand up to you on the battlefield, but you cannot win because of our numbers. You cannot kill us all. Ultimately, this man and his party supported the interim constitution. And he described Mandela as someone he thought he could do business with. In conclusion, I think that, in fact, there are four critical questions in any kind of ethnic conflict of this sort. One is, can there be a shared vision that the other side can find bearable? The other is whether the two sides can learn to trust each other enough to honor the commitments to make the intermediate steps necessary. And finally, there's a question of lost acceptance. Jean has studied this. and that is, in these kinds of protracted ethnic conflicts, each side is going to suffer losses through any resolution. And will they, in fact, be prepared to accept those losses? Mandela was someone who, in all these respects, helped make it happen. Thank you very much.
Echo around the world. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I want you to know that I love each and every one of you. From his Tulsa roots, as a lawyer and a revolutionary, that is known for all the benefits through pursuit to freedom and victory. The story of Nelson Mandela belongs with the great political leaders in world history. If I had to live again, I would do exactly the same thing. As long as our people are oppressed and deprived of everything to make human beings happy and to enjoy life, it was my duty to be involved. And I do it over and over again.
13 years ago, in 1986,
I was going to begin differently, but I must follow on what Bob Manukin was talking about, and that is the huge divide that there was between the white community and the black community in South Africa in 1990. And put yourself in the position of a minority white, 10% of the population in 1990. For 350 years, they had oppressed the black majority, crudely, racial oppression. And the majority of whites, for good reason, if not all whites, feared revenge. They put themselves in the position of the black majority and said, how would we react if we had been treated in that way? And I think the greatest single achievement of Nelson Mandela was to convince the then white leaders that revenge wasn't on his agenda. And it was his dignity, his personality, everything in him that persuaded first President Botha and later President de Klerk that revenge wasn't on the agenda. And it was their belief in him and in his renouncing of violence that I believe made it possible for them to talk their people into following them in ending apartheid. Without question, the greatest privilege of my life was to get to know Nelson Mandela on a personal, one-to-one basis. And that came about as a result of my appointment, in fact, by President de Klerk, but through the leadership of Kobie Coetzee, which was then Justice Minister, the last apartheid Justice Minister, to investigate the causes of the violence that began almost immediately after Mandela was released from prison. It was anticipated by everybody that there would be a difficult and maybe protracted negotiation period leading to democracy in South Africa, but nobody anticipated that it would be accompanied by violence. The political violence that ended in the deaths of, as Carrie mentioned, of over 10,000 mainly black but also white South Africans during that period. And of course it was Nelson Mandela's theory that the cause of the violence was what he called a third force, that there were elements in the police and the army that were fomenting the violence in an effort to derail the peace process and to ensure the continuation of racial oppression and to avoid a black majority taking over in South Africa. And together with 4 other South Africans, I was appointed to investigate the violence, and in particular to investigate Nelson Mandela's contention that this was not violence between black supporters of his African National Congress and black supporters of Chief Buthelezzi's and Carter Freedom Party, but that it was in fact instigated by white right-wing conservatives. And soon after we began our investigations, it became clear to me that it was necessary for me to meet not only and keep informed the then President, de Klerk, but also the leader of the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela. De Klerk didn't think that was a good idea. He said, I don't think you have any reason to report to Mr. Mandela. And he said, he's not the President, I am. And I said, yes, but Mr. President, he soon will be President. And he could hardly argue about that. It was in that atmosphere that Nelson Mandela frequently requested me to come and talk to him on a Sunday evening in his house in a white suburb of Johannesburg. He was very lonely. He was being looked after by one of his granddaughters. And on a Sunday evening he was alone, and he thought that was a good time to have a visit, and we spoke about many things, not only about the work of the Commission, but many issues of the day that arose. In fact, the personality of the man was quite incredible. One of those early visits, he said, let's watch the 8 o'clock news. In those days, the 8 o'clock news was the main television news of the day. And the first item was a visit paid by Nelson Mandela to one of the outlying areas of South Africa. And after the first item, he switched off the television. He said, I had to watch that. He said, you know, I still enjoy seeing myself on television. such a spontaneous act on his part. The purpose of my talking to you this afternoon is really to reflect and to share with you some of the personal experiences I had with Nelson Mandela that really helped demonstrate what Carrie and Bob were talking about in their very eloquent presentations. The first difficult issue I had with Nelson Mandela, and it was something that I spoke about on National Public Radio during the week, but let me fill in some of the details of that story. The commission that I headed was set up under a South African Act legislation that provided for the government to appoint a commission to investigate the causes of political violence and intimidation. And it took months of negotiations before President de Klerk convinced Nelson Mandela and Buthelezi and the other leaders who were negotiating about who should head the commission. And out of the blue, I received a call from Kobie Coetzee to tell me that it had been agreed that I should head that commission. He said it would be a very difficult commission, but I think it shouldn't last long. He said. It was a difficult decision whether to take it, because I'd then been a judge for a number of years, and the Justice Minister said to me, he said, this commission may be the end of your days in the judiciary, and that was obviously something that might have happened. The commission began, and it took months to really begin to unravel and collect evidence as to what was fomenting the violence. And after some months, there was huge pressure built up in the media, expectations. Expectations are terrible things, I think. I think too many people fail because of huge expectations that they have to face. I can think of one not too far from where we are. In any event, because of the pressure, I decided to put out an interim report, setting out in chronological sequence, and I stress that chronological sequence, the causes of violence in South Africa. We had no evidence of this third fault at that stage. Started with colonialism and talked about the apartheid system, the cruel policing that went with apartheid, and ended in the report, and it was chronological, with the violence between black supporters of Nelson Mandela and black supporters of Buthelezi. And the problem was that under the legislation under which we operated, I was obliged to give my report first to the President, de Klerk, and he could release it when he wished. And what he did with that report, and he had done it with a couple of preceding unimportant reports, he released it together with a government spin. There was a government statement commenting on the report. And on this occasion, the report was issued with a government press media release stating that I had blamed the violence on black violence, supporters of Mandela and Buthelezi, which was a complete misdescription of the report. But that grabbed the headlines. In all the newspapers, South African newspapers, that was the headline. Goldstone blames violence on Inkatha ANC politicians. And Mandela flew in that day from abroad, and he was faced with these media reports, and he had to address the second annual meeting of the African National Congress after its release. He castigated the report. He was very nasty about it. He made a nasty remark about me, and I knew what had happened, that he'd relied on this media report. And it would have been the end of the commission that he wanted and that de Klerk wanted, because it was helping keep the nation calm in a very difficult situation of violence. I was in my chambers at the court, the Supreme Court of Appeal, which was then our highest court, and my phone rang at 3 o'clock. It was Nelson Mandela, who incidentally always made his own telephone call. There was never a secretary or a representative. It was always that familiar voice on the other line. It always came as a shock hearing that voice. And he said, "I'm calling you for 2 reasons." He said, the first is to tell you that I did a terrible thing. I commented and I criticized your report without having read it. And I said, Madiba, I realized that it happened, and obviously it's come as a horrible surprise. And he said, well, that's the first reason I'm calling, is to apologize to you. He said, I should never have relied on the media. I should have read your report. And he said, the second reason I'm calling you is, he said, I've called a press conference for an hour from now at 4 o'clock, and I'm going to publicly apologize to you. He said, the second question to you is, will you accept may I say that you've accepted my apology? He did it for 2 reasons. Firstly, and I have no doubt, he felt he needed to apologize for what he did. But more importantly, he realized that the commission was important if there was going to be peace during the negotiation process. And he realized that if he didn't apologize publicly, it would have been the end of the commission. It would have been the early demise of that commission. There's no way I would have continued if I didn't have the support of the majority party in the country, the African National Congress. There would be no point. And for that was the reason, I have no doubt, that motivated his calling a press conference which got international attention, in which, as the leader of the African National Congress, he made a public apology. And I think it was said earlier by Carrie, how many leaders would have done that? It was his instinct, his political instinct, that drove him to do it. And I think it's a wonderful illustration of his character and of his shrewd political instinct that went with it. He was an interesting negotiator. Another personal story, some 2 years later, I was again alone with him. This was on a weekday afternoon, and I was telling, it was about 3 weeks before the first democratic election. This would have been in January of 1994. And we were talking about the serious events that were going on at that time, particularly in 2 of the Bantu stans, where where there were huge potential problems, in which in fact there were subsequently serious problems. And while we were talking, his physician, Dr. Ntato Motlana, walked in, and Mandela turned to me and said, "Oh, here's my doctor." He said, this is my monthly checkup. He said, "I hate these doctors." And I said, "Well, Madiba, it's a good time for me to leave." And he said, no, he said, "Let's carry on. We'll pretend that Ntato is not here, and you and I will go on talking." Dr. Motlana told him to take off his shirt. He wanted to take his blood pressure, and Mandela took off his shirt, and as he was about to start pumping the blood pressure gauge, Mandela's granddaughter walked in and said, "Grandfather, President de Klerk's on the line." Mandela turned to Motlana and to me and said, "I have to take this call. It's a very urgent matter relating to the forthcoming elections." He picked up his telephone, the call was put through, and he started off very politely. "Good afternoon, Mr. President," he said to de Klerk. And very soon, de Klerk said something, or asked him to do something that annoyed him. And he said, "Now look here, de Klerk," no longer Mr. President, "look here, de Klerk, I won't have that, and I won't do it, and I will not agree to it." And this went on for 2 or 3 minutes, and while Mandela, very annoyed, talking to de Klerk, Motlana was taking his blood pressure. When the phone was eventually almost banged down by Mandela, I said, "Ntato, what happened to Madiba's blood pressure?" He said, "You won't believe it didn't budge." and Mandela burst out laughing, and he said, "Of course not." He said, "It was a big act." But here was in fact exactly what Bob was talking about. Behind the table, it was his resolve. There were issues on which he was not prepared to compromise. And there were many issues on which he was prepared to compromise. One of the issues on which he wasn't prepared to compromise was on a new constitutional court. It was the last thing de Klerk wanted. De Klerk wanted the new constitution to be looked after by the judges who had been appointed during the apartheid era. And Mandela wouldn't have that. He wanted judges to be appointed who would represent the whole community. And at that time, bear in mind, South Africa had what I always like calling a pale male bench. Of the 200 superior court judges, all but 2 were white, and all but about 3 were men. And the bench had to be radically changed. And it was that demand, as I say, that he was absolutely not prepared to compromise. De Klerk undoubtedly, and I'm sure Bob will agree, de Klerk intended and had confident expectations that the negotiations would last for 10, maybe 15 years. There was no hurry. It was Mandela's shrewd political instinct and the way he conducted those negotiations that kept it to 4 years. It was the last thing on Mandela's, on de Klerk's agenda, was that within 4 years from 1990, from the release of Mandela, there would be a black majority government in South Africa. One of Mandela's other great successes, in my view, was he respected his opponents, and this really fits in again with everything that Bob Van Rooyen was talking about. He believed that if you respect your opponent is likely to respect you. If you look down and demonize your opponent, then there's really no hope for a successful negotiation. His forgiveness at times upset me. When I saw his hand around the prosecutor who asked for the death sentence against Mandela, a prosecutor called Percy Utah, who really wasn't a pleasant individual. When I saw Mandela's hand around Utah's shoulder, I felt annoyance. But there he did it, and it was genuine. When he went to visit Mrs. Verwoerd, the widow of the Prime Minister of South Africa, President of South Africa, who was really responsible for grand apartheid. It was that forgiveness. His wearing of the Springbok jersey, which many of you will have seen in the wonderful film Invictus. It was an instinctive a personality trait that he was prepared to forgive people who had caused so much harm and pain to himself and to his people. So certainly my own experience has been fully justified from afar by the remarks, the outstanding remarks from Carrie and Bob. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'd also like to start by thanking Professor Sternlight for inviting me and to acknowledge the Dean and other dignitaries in the room and everybody here. In South Africa, we have this term, if you're addressing a crowd and you know that there are many significant people in the crowd, and it's likely that you will miss somebody, you end your comments by saying all protocol observed. So I observed all protocol. Being the last speaker, of course, on this really very excellent panel means that there's very little room for me to be original or to say anything that you've not heard. All the accolades have been pronounced, this remarkable man and how he managed to unite South Africa and take it to a place, and how he's become probably the most iconic figure of the 20th century and early 21st century. I only met Nelson Mandela twice in my life, and I was very fortunate in that after the Constitution was drawn up, he agreed to write the foreword to a book that I co-authored with Professor Stephen Elman at New York Law School. But I was very fortunate because when I went to university in South Africa and I graduated from law school in the early 1980s, my first boss and somebody who became a friend and mentor, Arthur Chaskelson, had been one of the young lawyers at the treason trial that sent Nelson Mandela to Robben Island. And I was also mentored by people like George Bezos and Ismail Mohammed, the great legal giants of South Africa. And then Justice Goldstone was on the bench, and he admitted me as an advocate in the late 80s. So that was the sort of, I sort of felt very connected to a time in which, certainly when I grew up in Cape Town, and when I finished high school in the 70s, there was a new wave of Black consciousness movement and Steve Biko and a sort of different generation of activists. What I want to really say in the time allotted to me, really want to do three things. I also want to indulge a bit in commenting on Nelson Mandela and my perspectives as somebody who was not close to him personally, but certainly in terms of the history of South Africa and my own political development. And second, I would want to highlight the question of forgiveness and the major vehicle of forgiveness in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, like Nelson Mandela, has also become sort of an iconic institution for those who are engaged in political transition, and particularly moving societies from violence to democracy. And then the third thing that I would like to do is really explore the question about what that exercise in forgiveness through the TRC has meant for South Africa, and maybe looking back now that we've had 20 years of democracy and 1 year without the physical presence of Nelson Mandela, what this has meant for South Africa. It's a very large question. I only have about 12 minutes left, so I'm just going to touch on some of this. For me, the most intriguing question, in the midst of many, many questions about Nelson Mandela, is really how he was so successful in conscripting the international community into adopting the anti-apartheid course in South Africa, and how he became the world's most famous political prisoner and later the most beloved president. in light of his violent start. He did, as Carrie pointed out, he was a man that led an organization that was labeled a terrorist organization in this country. Also, how the African National Congress really became the sort of midwives of the democratic movement of South Africa, and an organization that operated in a clandestine way for obvious reasons, and which in fact gave birth to the democracy when the history preceding the elections in South Africa, one could say, was not typified by democracy. And then I guess I also was struck when Nelson Mandela died a year ago. I live in upstate New York, in Albany. And one of the things that I found remarkable was just the outreach from media outlets in Syracuse and Rochester and parts of New York you probably even hadn't heard of beyond New York City. And just the idea that the world was once again ignited by interest in this man. It's also his capacity to really hold skepticism and cynicism at bay. I mean, nobody has said one thing of great criticism. Maybe Judge Goldstone spoke about him getting angry at de Klerk. But there's very little that people talk about Nelson Mandela that's critical, and yet when we look at leaders, you mentioned this question of expectations. Revolutionary leaders were much admired. At some point, the glass goes off. I think about Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia. At some point, there was some disillusionment. Lech Walesa of Poland, the great union leader. And yet Nelson Mandela, up until his death, there wasn't one thing that was negative. And this was a man who had after all left a wife and 4 children for a young Winnie Mandela, who did lead an organization with questionable principles. I think it was remarkable. And so there was something very, very unique about him. The way that he had, I think that he had an extraordinary sense of his place in history. I've been watching this series on PBS on the Roosevelts. And one of the things that strikes you is how people think about themselves in history. I think that comes from privilege. That didn't come from privilege in Nelson Mandela, but everything about him. His capacity to be a teacher, his capacity to be a mentor, his capacity to be charming, his love of children. There are books being written. I was just reading, when I flew across yesterday, I was reading a book of personal stories from quote-unquote ordinary South Africans. There's a whole book about ordinary South Africans who nobody heard of, who met Nelson Mandela. And everything about him, he was just this extraordinary individual. So, and in many ways, I guess we're very lucky in South Africa, because South Africa could have just been a very ordinary country after a civil rights struggle. And Nelson Mandela, I think, made South Africa in many ways something bigger than what it was. But I think the most extraordinary thing about this idea of Mandela as a world leader, and how people in countries like the United States, all over Europe, Australia and so on, adopted this struggle about racial conflict, even when the conflict in their own societies, like in the United States, is still unfolding and unfinished. I mean, I'm constantly struck at how South Africa and what Nelson Mandela has managed to do in South Africa has somehow been so sort of celebrated at the same time that we struggle in this country with racism and the lingering effects of slavery and Jim Crow. But I think the most profound thing about Nelson Mandela was the concept of forgiveness that Justice Goldstone referred to. And that question of forgiveness was key to taking South Africa from extraordinary violence and bitterness to at least a country in which we can say that people who at one stage didn't know each other or hated each other terribly actually can live together, even though in a very imperfect way. And this concept of forgiveness as articulated through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is in my view the most powerful legacy of Mandela. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I don't think, is the panacea. Brian Stevenson, whom many of you may know, is a civil rights lawyer who does a lot of work on death row. And a friend shared with me that he came to give a talk in Wisconsin a week ago. And in the course of his talk, he spoke about how in the United States there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because there's so many problems around race, and so the racial healing has yet to happen. I'm sort of struck by this idea that people have given to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And yet the TRC really was just a compromise, a very imperfect compromise. The TRC was developed with a sense of forgiveness, but knowing that this was not a Nuremberg-style tribunal where there were victors and losers. Both parties had to compromise and come to some agreement in which a vehicle towards reconciliation was possible. So this great compromise, I think, centered on forgiveness was so important. I had students, I was teaching in New York at the time, and I had students who went to work at the TRC over the course of the 2 years. And one of the most remarkable things that they shared with me was how during the public hearings, when the victims could come forward and face their perpetrators and find out and get the details of the torture and the disappearances and the deaths and so on, how under the leadership of then Archbishop Desmond Tutu, what could have turned into an extraordinary ritual of revenge and hatred became one of forgiveness. And the theatre, the public theatre of forgiveness and repentance from the perpetrator, forgiveness from the vehicle. These were very, very important rituals for South Africa, centered on the notion of forgiveness. The other thing about the TRC, which was important, was the idea of naming names. That people had to know they were not. One of the things that Brian Stevenson mentioned in his lecture was that Americans have not been given the names of many of the people who committed the murders and the disappearances and so on. The TRC named names, which was important. But it also did something which Justice Goldstone referred to in his radio interview, that the TRC created an official record for which there would never be denial. No South African can say this did not happen. There was a record created. And so the idea that you had to compromise, you had to center this institution and this mechanism in forgiveness was very, very important. So I guess the third thing that I wanted to focus on was this idea of forgiveness, Nelson Mandela's extraordinary example, his leadership, and the moment in which we, South Africans, had to finally take responsibility for creating a new society and a democracy. Looking back, what did it mean? I think that there are two things that stand out to me as a critique and which lingers on in the society. And that is that racism and the effects of racism were obviously the most important, the preeminent considerations in South Africa. But hidden under that racist artifice was a patriarchy and a sexism that has really vexed South African and is the most, I think, troubling question. And one sees it in the TRC. With the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it became very, very clear that women were seen as secondary victims. They were the mothers, they were the daughters, they were the sisters. They were not seen as people who had been detained and who had been tortured and so on. So that was I think that lacked, that was missing in the TRC, and eventually they did have 3 days of hearing on gender, quote-unquote gender crimes. And I think this question of gender equality is one of the most difficult questions that South Africa is dealing with. And then the second is that this world beyond Mandela, I think that the foundation that he laid, the foundation of forgiveness, the foundation of love, and the capacity of South Africans to really empathize with the other, that has become strained as the promise of democracy, particularly around economic equality, around some of the questions on violence and so on, have now become very, very tested. And so one sees that, that the idea of being so fortunate to have an iconic person who was a good person centered in transformation is also one of the disadvantages in South Africa, because the focus on just one person, who really, South Africa was really more than just the efforts of one individual. How do you go back to the creation of a shared ethos without this person? I constantly hear people talk about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and say things like, maybe the Palestinians need a Mandela. Or in any other conflict, people talk about, well, they don't have a Mandela. And I think that that is, as much as it's a compliment, I think that in the end, that something shared and an ethos that is translated and really internalized is clearly the most lasting one. But we are very, very fortunate in that in South Africa, the legacy of Mandela and what he stood for will hopefully sort of ensure that that the promise of constitutional democracy continues. I'm going to end, but what I did was, there's a cartoonist in South Africa, Jonathan Shapiro. He goes under the name Zapiro. And what I did, I sort of look at his cartoons regularly, and I thought I'd compare a series of cartoons showing the life and the death of Nelson Mandela. So that is when he became the president. That was what something happened on the planet. In fact, I visited Vietnam in 1990, when there weren't many visitors in Vietnam. And I kept on telling people they want to know where I was from, so I said South Africa. This was about 6 months after Mandela had been released. And then they couldn't, I said, Mandela, Nelson Mandela. Yeah, now we know who you're talking about. So that was him in the first parliament, this giant of a man. This was when he was ill. Did everybody see? When he was ill, the whole world watching. When he was really ill, and people wanted him, hold on. That's him close there. Of course, the little, it says Mandela is lying in state, and the little caption is, and so I see Zuma was the president. And then it's, and Mandela being all, saying, icon, meaning, oh really, that's not the case. It's this icon the world is saying farewell to. And then that's really saying farewell to you. I mean, that is the hope. That Madiba magic, we won't run out of it in South Africa. Thank you so much.
Penny, I think all of us want these versions. These are wonderful, and with such an amazing panel. And first, I want to thank everyone for just keeping on schedule. We have a lot of time for questions. I'm going to make some overarching comments and then happily moderate and leave the audience with plenty of time for questions. So there were a number of interesting things that struck me. The first, and both Penny and Richard made this point, we only heard good things, and if there was anything that was a little snippet of perhaps a negative, was this idea that some deception, some secrecy was necessary. And so was the lie of I have not negotiated, or the deception or the secrecy, necessary for good? And do we view that as a character flaw, a situational flaw? Might that have been the only flaw ever? Is one question to bat back to you. Second thought. Can we take the personal qualities that we've all talked about up here from Nelson Mandela and really what happened in South Africa was to institutionalize those into the TRC. And is that something that provides us lesson in actually finding the fuel for the future? That when you have this iconic leader, you've got to find a way of institutionalizing those very values because the leader is so iconic. Another question. Was the key achievement for Mandela persuading his enemies or his friends? Or is it the combination of both, as so many, Bob in particular, argued? And is the problem that we face in the world that there are so few leaders who can do both? So you might be good at talking to your people, or you might be good at talking to the other side, but that we are still waiting for this icon that it seems only once a century we run across a leader who is capable of doing both. And if we were to give advice to any of us who are involved in conflict, do we have to wait and look for the Mandela, as Penny so wisely put it, or can we create a Mandela? And how does one who's involved in conflict try to either find that person or create the situation in which someone could arise? And if we're going to be hanging our hat on waiting for the next Mandela, many of us will continue to wait. So what do we need to build into our conflict situations where there is not a Mandela in order to try and move that forward? So those were a few of my kind of overarching questions, thoughts, comments, and I'm happy to let our panelists take a nibble at that, or Jean is going to happily run the mic around and open it up to our audience. I don't know if there's any comments or thoughts from any of them. Is there anything? Richard.
Andrea, thank you. I think those are some excellent questions, and just let me respond very briefly to not all of them. The first is that that must be recognised is that Mandela, I think, truly represented his people, maybe the best of his people, that he didn't lead them in a direction they didn't want to go. During the darkest apartheid years, there was frustration and anger in the black community. And as somebody who lived through that period, I never came across hatred. It may be that it was a black majority that had the confidence of being a majority. And South Africa was perhaps unique in that regard, that we had a majority that was oppressed, not a minority. And I think that made it easier. I think on that score, de Klerk was in a way facing a much more difficult situation. He was leading his people where they didn't want to go. And he had the leadership ability to convince them, not definitely so on moral grounds. And this was something that frustrated Archbishop Tutu when de Klerk apologised for apartheid before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Tutu wept. And the reason, and I discussed it with Desmond Tutu, the reason was that de Klerk apologised for apartheid not because it was immoral. He apologised because it didn't work. And thank goodness, and I said this during a long 5 days that I spent at Newlands cricket ground watching a cricket game with Archbishop Tutu, and I said to him, you and I are lucky that de Klerk didn't apologise for moral reasons. And he said, why? And I said, if he'd have gone to his people in 1990 and said, my dear people, we must abandon apartheid because it's immoral, he wouldn't have lasted 24 hours. He went to his people and said, my dear people, we must abandon apartheid because we're all going to get killed. That they could understand.
Yeah.
And I think that, so they led from two very different corners. And it's the reason I think that de Klerk and Mandela didn't really like each other at all. And I know that, not that I ever saw them together, other than on official occasion, but I know from discussions with each that they didn't like each other. But they trusted each other. And they knew, and this is crucial, they knew each could deliver what he undertook. And I think that is a problem in situations like the Middle East, where I don't believe they're leaders who can deliver. If they reached an agreement tomorrow, I'm not sure that they would carry their people.
Sorry, I just want to make I guess it's such an obvious point, the question that you raised about how do we create Mandelas or sort of move a conflict. And I'm thinking of the situation that we find ourselves in today in this country, and how we are educating and socializing young people just to be able to talk to people that they disagree with. It may be that I've spent too much of my time in universities and particularly law faculties where it's hard to really engage with people that you disagree. And I worry that if we look at the state of discourse in the media and elsewhere, that we're losing the capacity to really sort of reach out. And I think that's the Mandela declared, these stories are grand stories. But I think just on a very daily level, for people to be able to disagree in a courteous way and be able to develop the skills to disagree, to move a discussion forward, I think that's the challenge for all of us who are educating the next few generations.
Thank you. Karen,
I'll just underscore that last point. And I think it's a role that law schools can perform, and to some degree do, and it's a role that in terms of conflict resolution, in places like the Saltman Center especially, can help people learn to be better at it. As I indicated earlier, in my view, an absolutely indispensable negotiation skill, if you want to effectively represent your own client or your own people, is the capacity to demonstrate to the other side, in a non-judgmental way, you understand their perspective. Now, it turns out this is a very challenging thing to do. And the reason it's a challenging thing to do is people confuse demonstrating understanding with sympathy or agreement. And I think that, in fact, the capacity, and lawyers can do this often, to demonstrate an understanding of the other side's arguments, and then disagree with them. And the capacity of people in conflict to do this doesn't necessarily create forgiveness. It's not the same. It's the fear that I'm being asked to forgive. It's the fear that I'm being asked to characterize my own position as immoral that often restrains it. But I think it's indispensable. I completely agree with you about that. And I guess I think it's a place where there can be a real role for education, including professional education.
I was just going to respond a little bit to something I didn't have enough time to talk about, and that is partially what made Mandela great and what we could all learn from him. He grew up and taught himself in many different worlds. He began in his rural, small town, subjected to rituals of very painful adulthood, circumcision ceremony. He ran away from that world because he was about to be put into an arranged marriage he didn't believe in, and ran to Johannesburg, where he worked and lived with miners in South Africa at the same time that he was working as a law clerk in a liberal white law firm. The extraordinary man was made out of an unbelievable depth of very different experiences. And I think that's what allowed him to develop some of the empathy that Bob's talking about, because he didn't see the world only through the two eyes of the way in which he was brought up. He sought out different worlds to live in, to educate himself in, to communicate with people. He felt an empathy for the miners and the conditions they were living in, so I didn't get to talk about it, but he worked a lot with trade unions and the miner movement without having necessarily been one himself. Willie Mandela was a social worker. He worked with social workers, teachers, was in the first black law firm in Johannesburg. So to the extent that we want to teach people to internalize some of Mandela, if there are any students in the audience, and even us grown-ups, we're still not beyond that. I think we learn to build that kind of empathy by getting outside of our own comfort zones and living in different worlds, and then, this is the difference between sympathy and empathy, not seeing that world through our own eyes, through our own upbringing, and through the ways in which we've been taught, by trying to experience the world as the people who live in those worlds experience them. And I think Mandela had an enormous gift and ability to do that. And as I said, I think part of being in prison for a long time also teaches you that. There's a quietness. He did literally chop rocks for a long time. There was labor in that. And he used it as an opportunity to discipline his physical muscle, and I like to think he was working his physical muscles when, at night, when he was alone, he was exercising both his heart muscles and his brain muscles. And he was able to do that by spending some quiet time. So for those of you who are doing some mindfulness work and all that, that's part of the work too. Mandela did internal work and external work. And I think that's a very important part of how people can learn to be little bits of Mandela. I also want to say, picking up on Penny's comments, I struck out from my comments, it's in the footnotes, the fact that almost every great leader these days, Gandhi, Mandela, they did have flaws. Penny sort of alluded to it, but this is a man who left his first wife, and there were accusations, never proven, but accusations that there was domestic violence in that first marriage. And many of you, if you've read the biographies of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, one of our great icons, these were great men and they were also flawed men. And so that's a downside, but I want to say that the other side of it is for some of the truly great leaders, they do marry something else. They marry their cause and they marry justice, as I said earlier. And so we're all human beings, and it's absolutely impossible to be totally good. And so some of the greatest leaders demonstrate their commitment to these larger things, and for that we thank them. And some of us just try to be every day ordinarily human. And it's very hard to do those two things together. And I just want to say this is very difficult work.
All right, with that, let me go ahead and open it up to the audience and see if we have some questions.
I have a real simple question for anybody on the panel. Are there any Mandelas out there today in the world that we can talk about that are on the horizon, coming or existing?
I've heard that Brian Stevenson, he's being referred to as an emerging Mandela. Brian Stevenson is a civil rights lawyer who lives in Alabama. He does work on death row. He's just published a book, extraordinary person. So that's what, this is certainly in the United States.
Any other nominations? Hello? You might be loud enough to talk in.
Mandela found it politically advantageous to avoid demonization and to develop trust, which was the exact opposite of many of our current political leaders around the world who favor demonization and distrust. What was it about his circumstance that led to that, and can we teach many of our current leaders to learn from his example?
I think much is to be learned by really focusing on the terrible leadership dilemmas, particularly in international conflicts, between the tension and the necessity of constantly being negotiating behind the table with your own constituents and across the table with the other side, especially in a world where there's no acoustic separation. The other side is going to hear what you say to your own people. And the dilemma is, in order to mobilize your own base, the tragedy is demonization works. Because when people feel angry, when they feel hurt, you're demonstrating empathy to them by saying, the bastards on the other side are what caused it, they deserve it. But this is the core challenge. And in terms of the question about where are the Mandelas, I mean, an indispensable feature of a great leader, if they're going to move towards some degree of peace and reconciliation, is they've got to have the skills, the political skills, to manage this very challenging task, both behind the table and across the table. And I think that sometimes there are such leaders, and sometimes external circumstances can create so much pain on both sides that even without that kind of leadership, people can muddle along and reach a better place. But it's not easy. And the challenge, and the problem, I mean, what I say, as I say, I've spent a lot of time working on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and you especially hear this from Israelis. Where's our Mandela? Arafat was no Mandela. It's absolutely true, by the way. But what I say is, where is the Mandela on Israel's side, who's painting a picture of a shared future that the other side would at least find bearable? Okay? And it's very easy to say, I want the other side to have their Mandela. And you see, and the dilemma, of course, is that in fact, and part of my own view of the tragedy of the current situation, within Israel, it's probably a politician on the center right that has a prayer of being able to achieve it, because there's such fractures among Jews within Israel. And the center left, or lefties, who I might find more congenial in many other ways, they don't have a prayer of being able to manage the behind-the-table conflict. And the difficulty is on the Palestinian side. I think Abu Mazen in many ways is an admirable man. However, his influence in Gaza, zippo. And your question about who's the next Mandela, I have no notion of whether he has the character or not. But when I interviewed students at the University of Bethlehem, a few years ago, I said, who are your heroes? Arafat was still alive. And they said, Barghouti, Marwan Barghouti. There was a Palestinian who's in the Israeli prisons, who was said to have blood on his hands, who was part of Fatah, who probably would have the capacity to have a broad range of Palestinians support him. But what no one has much of a notion of is, does he have the, would he want to, and would he have the courage to? And I have no idea. Would he be able to paint a picture? But I think it's going to take people on both sides who have, in that conflict, who have the capacity to diminish the internal conflicts within each community.
Can I just say, I think it's an important question, but I don't know if that's really the question. If you look at Mandela and the time in which he emerged, it was sort of pre-Google, pre-Facebook, pre-technology of hatred, and I think that the moment, the historical moment in which Mandela emerged and his capacity to make everybody love him, there was everybody, even his enemies. I don't think that moment of history can ever be captured again, not with the technologies and the way we've... So maybe the question is not, I think it's an important question, but I cannot see an individual emerging out of this morass of, as I said, technology of hate to do what he did.
Let's just add two very short comments about each. De Klerk came from the extreme right wing of his party. It was very important because his credentials couldn't be questioned by his party. And Mandela, on the other side, I think, is the only politician that I've ever heard of who didn't make a mistake for 27 years.
That's right.
I wanted to just touch upon something both Justice Goldstone and Dean Andrews just mentioned, hate, the word hate. And you said something, Richard, in your comments about not sensing on the part of a long oppressed black majority hate, similar to Nelson Mandela, and overcoming that with forgiveness. And that seemed to be almost a societal part of the reconciliation process. How do you explain that? And maybe you could just touch upon also, because I think it's kind of a symbolic example, the constitutional court on which you served and which President de Klerk was opposed to sits in a, as I recall, in a rather interesting location, site. The selection of that, the symbolism of that, was that part of that process in the country of South Africa? And I guess actually what Penny said, the communication that we have now maybe makes it more difficult to have a population without so much hate with the instant communication that we have. But I wonder if you could just touch upon those, because I think that's something that seems to exist in a lot of other places in the world where there is conflict, and that is a real sense of hate on the part of so many people that apparently was not as common.
I don't know if Penny agreed with me about the absence of hate, but it was certainly my life's experience from my earliest days and until the present day. And as I indicated earlier, I think one possible explanation is the fact that it was a majority that had been oppressed and hadn't lost its confidence. And for the majority of black South Africans, I think it's fair to say it was a question of when, not if, we get our freedom. They never conceived that it would never happen. It happened a lot quicker than many might have expected, but it wasn't that unexpected. And the second is it may well be that Africans have a forgiving nature. I think one sees it elsewhere in Africa, where the previous colonial regime was not hated, and people could come to terms. I don't know, Penny.
I don't know, the absence of hate or whether people are forgiving and so on. I think I agree with you. When I first came to New York as a graduate student in the 1980s, after having grown up in South Africa, in Cape Town, in a very different cultural ethos, I soon got to see in New York City that what I regarded as natural courtesies and showing was a complete, that then people saw me as a sucker and weak. And that for me was a lesson. And I think that culturally things happen in South Africa and many African countries which no longer happen in the United States for whatever reason. And it's localized, of course, this country is too large to make such a generalization. But daily acts of kindness and consideration is so absent from particularly large cities. And a certain cynicism and suspicion has so gripped our sort of milieu and I think that's the difference. Is the capacity to hate is not something that you you don't pick it up. I certainly didn't pick it up, and even during the transition, it was like that. But I wanted to go back to an earlier point as well about Nelson Mandela and this whole idea of forgiveness and love. He was, I think, a master strategist, not in the cynical way, but he used symbolism very strongly to push forward this message of love. He knew exactly when. He was, the press conference where he was going to apologize to you. He would make these stops and just talk to little children. He would just arrive at somebody's bar mitzvah. And, those kinds of, he was really masterful at that. So in our society, it will be seen as cynical. So I think that's the difference. It's sort of hard to say something like Africans are more forgiving because it always seems that, the stereotype, we don't like stereotypes. But I do think that acts of kindness and courtesy I lament that living in large cities here.
This question goes to everybody, but I can start with Carrie. And in a world of such violence today, and a world where today we talk about Nelson Mandela and his effort as a freedom fighter, engaging in armed struggle, and even on the day that he was released, part of his speech was talking about the continuation of that armed struggle. And Carrie, to her credit, faced that question forthrightly and said, well, yes, let's not forget that he too engaged in armed struggle. And in a world today where we see this going on all throughout the globe. I'm wondering, Carrie and others, what lessons do we learn from Nelson Mandela about the role of violence in reform and freedom struggles?
Lesson number one, we will not eliminate it. When people use violence, it's because they feel helpless, not heard. I mean, and I don't mean this in an impersonal way, I mean in a structural, national, group, religious, class, gender, any of that stuff. Violence, what you do when you've got no place else to go. And it's not going to stop until everybody feels like they have a place in the world. So take whatever violence that you think is the most illegitimate at the world, at the moment, the senseless beheadings, ISIS, just pick your favorite one. And while you're busy hating it or condemning it because you say, we don't do any of that, I say, look behind it. What does it mean? Yes, there's true evil in the world. I don't disagree with Bob's first little slide. There is some true evil in the world. But a lot of the violence that you see existing, it may not be rational in the sense that it comes from the head. It is trying to tell us something. Whoever's doing it is saying, I got nothing else to do. I have no other tools. And that's why Mandela said to Gandhi, or to Gandhi's son or whatever, there was a different situation in India. The British, though I'm never ever apologetic about what the British have done to the rest of the world, the British behaved differently in India, and so in some respects, Gandhi could use nonviolent resistance in a different way in which it was not possible with different structural oppression. So I say to you that I take violence seriously when I see it. I mentioned briefly, I was in SDS in Colombia in 1968, and I left at the point that SDS merged into the Weather People, and I was there when I wasn't there in the house, but the Boudin house that was blown up in Greenwich Village, because a bomb went off that wasn't supposed to go off, and I was appalled. I come from a long line of pacifists in Europe, so I'm not for violence, but I completely understand when it has to be used. And I would just say for people that, all of us, who don't want people senselessly killed, the extent to which we overly condemn the violence and say it's senseless and stupid and terrible, we need to do everything, including using more violence to combat it, it will increase unless people hear the messages behind it.
I'll just add one short comment. I think that in terms of conflict resolution, the two emotions that make it most difficult, in my view, are fear and anger. And it's not so much, there's been talk about the absence of a desire for revenge. And I take Richard at his word. I mean, he lived there, he knows. But there was a lot of fear and a lot of anger, even though the blacks were a majority, because what they thought they were up against. Moreover, I have to sort of add a modest, just question mark about the notion of, and it may be culturally true, that somehow South Africans in particular, and Africans in general, it's different. But one only has to look at the Tutsis and the Hutus. One has to look at Sudan and South Sudan. I mean, there are so many examples within Africa of peoples who have lived together for decades successfully, where through a combination of fear and anger they can be mobilized to do deeply inhumane things. So I just add that as a cautionary note about optimism because of how particular cultures operate. I think in terms of the human condition, I guess my own view is we have to face ourselves, and being fearful enough or angry enough, we all have the capacity to do terrible things.
I'd like to end on a more positive note. But that does make you want to go outside and drink. So, how about that as a connection? So, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, the Saltman